Hi, I'm Emma.
And I'm Helena, and we both work at the MS Trust. Just a little disclaimer, we're recording this over Zoom, so apologies if the sound is a bit iffy at any stage.
We'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Multiple Sclerosis, Breaking It Down, and to this episode about working life and MS, including some of the issues that might bring.
Most people with MS receive the diagnosis as adults in the midst of working life. And the impact of MS in your working life will very much depend on what type of work you do and your personal experience of MS. But unfortunately, a lot of reports tells us that people with MS often stop work earlier than they want to or need to. So this podcast will be talking about how you can try to stay in work. What rights do people with MS have? How do we disclose about MS best? And what to do when you feel like you have to give up work. First, we'll be chatting to a discrimination case worker about your rights and the ins and outs of the Equality Act. And later on, we'll be talking to Gideon, who is a person with MS who also happens to be an HR professional. So really wearing two hats for this podcast.
Just before we start, here's a little bit of information about who we are. So myself and Helena work at the MS Trust. We're a UK charity for people affected by multiple sclerosis. The MS Trust is here for everyone affected by MS from the moment of diagnosis and throughout your journey. So we're here for you today, tomorrow, and every day after, making sure that a life with MS isn't a life defined by MS. We provide trusted information to help people with MS live their best life possible. We train and educate MS health professionals to offer the best care, and we also fund MS nurses in the areas of greatest need.
And now let's get back to work in MS. We have so many questions to crack on with today. So without further ado, let's chat with Lance Baynham, a case discrimination worker, about your rights as a working person with MS. Hi, Lance. Thank you for coming to chat to us on this Work in MS podcast. Do you mind start off by just introducing yourself and tell us a little bit what your background is?
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much for having me on the podcast. I'm Lance Baynham, and I'm the Discrimination Case Worker at South West London Law Centres. I personally work under a legal aid contract with people with discrimination claims, including disability discrimination claims. And then the Law Centre employment team also provides advice appointments, short appointments to provide people with advice on a whole range of employment situations.
So we've got quite a lot of questions. So I'm gonna start off.
Sure.
So if you are recently diagnosed with MS, or you might start a new job, or you've been in the same position for a while, should you tell your employer, or do you have to tell your employer?
This situation involves a number of kind of personal or emotional considerations, which I obviously can't talk to so much, but I can talk a bit about the legal considerations that apply. And so obviously it's going to depend on your personal circumstances. Mm-hmm. Some employers might be great, really open and receptive, and others, I've seen in my role, not all employers are brilliant. One thing to say is that a number of the protections that the Equality Act provides for people with disabilities only apply if your employer knows or could reasonably know that you are disabled. For example, we'll talk, I'm sure, in a bit more detail about reasonable adjustments and the duty an employer has to make reasonable adjustments in more detail later on. But an employer only has that duty to make reasonable adjustments if they know or could reasonably be expected to know that someone has a disability. And so if you want your employer to make some kind of adjustment, then obviously that's going to involve some sort of conversation. Yeah. So if you're in that situation, your condition's progressed and you do think there needs to be some adjustments made, then that's probably a conversation that you're then going to inevitably have to have.
Yeah.
Let's say you're in a position where you've just been diagnosed. Your MS hasn't progressed to a level yet where you require some sort of adjustment mm-hmm. to the role you're doing, then it might still be a good idea, and obviously again this depends on your circumstances, but it might still be helpful to have to disclose that to your employer so that they're aware, and so that if further down the line you then have to have another conversation, if your condition's progressed and you're then having to talk about adjustments, that hasn't come as a kind of surprise to your employer. It's already been an open, kind of honest and conversation between the two of you. And I think there's been some research as well which shows that people that disclose their MS or other conditions generally sort of stay in employment longer and so on than others. And obviously that's very broad sort of research rather than your individual circumstances. But so that's what I say about, you know, the benefits of an employer or of disclosing. But a couple of kind of qualifying points on that. For your employer to know that you have MS, it doesn't mean that everyone in the organization that you work for needs to know. So, like I said, some protections only apply if your employer knows that you have a disability. But it might be that, you know, if you just spoke to, say, someone in HR, then that would count as your employer knowing, and you could say, I don't want all of my colleagues to know, and you know, I'm worried about how if they might treat me differently. That would mean that your employer still knows, but again, not everyone that you work with knows. And your employer also has duties of confidentiality towards you, so they wouldn't be able to then just go spread that knowledge around. So I think generally it can be a good idea, but obviously it depends on someone's individual circumstances to some extent.
So you mentioned like Disability Act and Equality Act and things like that. As a person with MS, what are your rights at work? Because when we talk about disability, some people with MS obviously don't see themselves as disabled. Some do. It's a bit of again, like a personal preference. But what's your actual rights at work?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting what you say, that some people might consider themselves disabled or not, and obviously, you know, MS affects people in a whole range of different ways. But the Equality Act, which is the most relevant piece of legislation, is the source of protections that apply to disabled people. And actually what that says is that there are a number of conditions which are automatically deemed to be disabilities. And MS is one of them. So, and there's very few, it's only MS, cancer, HIV infection. I think there's a very small number, but MS is one of those that means you automatically are considered disabled and have the benefits of the protections that the Equality Act provides. And again, you might still not like to think of yourself as disabled, and that's absolutely fine, but you do have the protections of the Equality Act. So the Equality Act prohibits certain conduct in accordance with what are called protected characteristics. And those are things like race, sex, age, sexual orientation, and so on, and also including disability. So there are a number of protections that apply. So you have protection from direct discrimination, which is where an employer treats someone less favourably than someone else because of a protected characteristic. And likewise, protection from harassment, so unwanted conduct related to a protected characteristic. I'm not going to talk about those in much detail because they apply kind of across the range of protected characteristics. But there are a couple of protections that apply specifically for disabled people. The first is the duty on an employer to make reasonable adjustments, which I'm sure lots of people will be familiar with in terms of just hearing the concept at least. So that duty is essentially a duty on the part of an employer to adjust any what are called provisions, criteria, or practices, commonly referred to as a PCP, to avoid the disadvantages that disabled people face. So essentially, it's a positive duty that an employer has to adjust its policies, practices, requirements, and so on, if they create some kind of difficulty for a disabled person compared to someone who's not disabled. So let's say an employer's practice is that people work pretty continuously from when they arrive at work to when they finish work. And let's say one of the consequences of someone's MS is fatigue, and that makes it difficult to work continuously for that period of time. An adjustment to that practice would be that you have rest breaks on account of the difficulty that that requirement has for you, given your disability. So that's kind of an example of how that would work. One other specific protection that disabled people have is what's called discrimination arising from disability. And what that is it prohibits an employer treating someone unfavorably because of one of the consequences of their disability. So let's say one of the consequences of your MS is that you have to have quite a lot of time off work for health-related reasons, for treatment, for recovery, and so on. And let's say eventually, an employer then says that your level of absence is, unacceptable, and they dismiss you as a result. Now, the reason for that treatment would not be your disability. In other words, if someone without any disability had the same level of absence, they would be treated in the same way. But the reason for the treatment, which is the level of absence, is a consequence of your disability. And so if you were then treated unfavorably because of that, that's what this provision of the Equality Act prohibits. The caveat to that, and it's an important one, is that that unfavorable treatment can be justified. So there is a point at which, if you've had enough absence, or absent for long enough or frequently enough, that an employer could be justified potentially in eventually dismissing someone as a result. But they're going to have to show that they didn't really have any other option. There wasn't any less drastic treatment they could have done. Have they taken steps to help the disabled employee with their absence? So that they'll have to make sure they can demonstrate all of those things. Because of the risk otherwise that people with disabilities will be treated unfavorably because of the consequences of their disability that they can't do anything about.
I was just going to say, I think we'll talk a little bit further on, maybe when things go wrong. I just wondered if you find yourself in a situation where you feel like things are maybe going a little bit weird with your employer, is there a good sort of aim to try and really collect all the documentation that you have? So if things go wrong, that you have sort of a paperwork or documentation to show that what your employer has done and what your, say, MS nurses and the health professionals have done.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, it's useful to kind of keep a documentary record of the conversations you're having with your employer. So if, say, you want there's an adjustment to your role that you think you require, it's good to put that request in writing, potentially additionally to having an in-person conversation, but also make it clear that request is in writing, that you want a response in writing, that whatever is agreed is put in writing, that after a conversation with your employer, you make a note of what was discussed, so that you have that record potentially for any internal conversations if, like you say, it becomes a bit weird, or even beyond that, if there is a kind of tribunal process or something, then that's all going to be really relevant. So keeping a good record of what's been discussed and what's been agreed is definitely a good idea.
You mentioned the Equality Act. Is that sort of replacing what was previously known as, was it the Disability Act? Because I see these kind of popping up, both terminology, but it's called the Equality Act these days, is it?
So most of the, if not all of these protections that prohibit discrimination come from EU law. So there was various EU directives that member states, obviously when we were a member of the EU, then transposed into domestic law. So that's what then gave rise to the Sex Discrimination Act and the Disability Discrimination Act. And then the Equality Act in 2010 consolidated all of those different pieces of legislation in one kind of scheme, which prohibits different types of discrimination on the basis of different protected characteristics. So yeah, essentially that has replaced what previously was lots of different individual statutes.
You mentioned reasonable adjustments, and this is obviously something we do hear a lot. But what is it? What can you actually? What is a reasonable adjustment?
So there's no kind of shopping list of potential adjustments. There's no set limits at all. It's so it could potentially be anything. So if there is a policy or a requirement or some kind of practice that your employer has that puts you at a disadvantage because of your MS, compared to people who don't have MS, then the duty to make reasonable adjustments potentially arises. So anything that might avoid that disadvantage is potentially an adjustment. And then the question is just, is it reasonable or not? And that will depend on things like, would it work? Would it actually be effective? How practicable is it? What would be the consequences on other employees? All those kind of things. So having said that, that there's no set sort of potential list of adjustments. There are some common ones that that come up more frequently. So time off for medical appointments might be an adjustment. If someone's been absent for an extended period of time, let's say for treatment or recovery from or whatever it might have been, having a phased return to work. So rather than just going, on Monday you're in full week, you have, working 1 day a week or 2 days a week and kind of build it up. Adjusting your working hours would be a potential adjustment. Working from home might be an adjustment. Let's say your role normally requires you to be on your feet quite a lot, then having the provision of a chair or somewhere to rest would be an adjustment. Your equipment might be adjusted, so you might have special software on your laptop or whatever that allows you to continue working, avoiding difficulties that you face as a result of your MS. It might be that your duties themselves are adjusted. So let's say there's a part of your role that you're now struggling to do that might be made not part of your role anymore, or you might have specific help with that. And it might even be that if your conditions kind of progress to an extent that you can't perform your role at all because of the nature of your role, it might be that an adjustment would actually be moving you to a different role entirely in the organization. If that's reasonable, and obviously that'll be fact dependent on whether that's reasonable or not, but that's a potential adjustment. So those are some common ones that come up, but essentially anything that might avoid disadvantage that you're put to as a result of your MS, a reasonable adjustment. And the question is just, is it reasonable or not? And really that your employer should realize that it's very much in their interests as well to be as kind of open and cooperative as possible, because otherwise they've got to, if they lose an employee because they can't continue carrying out their role without an adjustment, then they've got to go to all the work and costs of recruiting, hiring someone else, training them up, all those kind of things. So actually in the round, it's often going to be by far the best solution for them to be to engage with and cooperate with a disabled employee to help them in the ways that they can to continue doing their role.
Well, we were talking about disclosure before. So if you're applying for a new job, so a completely new organization, and you're in the interview or when you're writing your cover letter or what have you, should you talk about you having MS before sort of accepting a new role or at the interview?
I mean, so again, the question of whether you should or not might depend on your individual circumstances. Excuse me. Generally, you certainly don't have to disclose it. And in fact, an employer under Section 60 of the Equality Act, if anyone's particularly interested, is prevented from or prohibited from asking potential employees before offering them a job about their health, other than for certain reasons. So, and if they do ask a question, if in the interview they say, ask a kind of question about how, about your health, then the disabled candidate subsequently doesn't get the job, they can claim direct discrimination, and the employer will have the task of proving that they didn't make that decision on the basis of what the questions and answers to those questions about someone's health. So the reasons when an employer can ask about someone's health prior to offering them the role are to see if someone can comply with the assessment process. So, are there reasonable adjustments we can make to the recruitment process, breaks in the interview or whatever it might be, to see if you can carry out something absolutely essential to the role. So if you're being hired to be a scaffolder, then they can ask to make sure you can climb a ladder, for example. They can ask about your health for monitoring purposes, to see if a disabled person can benefit from some sort of positive action. So it might be that they have a guaranteed first round interview for disabled applicants, or there might be an occupational requirement. So the MS Trust might want to hire someone specifically with MS for a particular role, and that would be a genuine occupational requirement. So short answer is that generally an employer shouldn't ask about your health except for those reasons prior to making a job offer. So whether you do or not, it's kind of down to you. It might be that you have kind of sufficient trust in the employer that you're comfortable even at that very early stage being open about it, or you might very understandably prefer to go through the interview process, go through the whole assessment process, whatever it is, hopefully get the job and then think about disclosing it at a later point.
I often think about, because I've always been very open about my MS. I do these podcasts where I talk about my MS and things like that. And I kind of always wondered what would happen if I would go to apply for a job, and it's very out there already in the public domain, whether that would, you would hope that it obviously wouldn't work against me, but you sort of still wonder, because of some of the very many horror stories I've heard about people, that you sort of worry that people with MS try to sort of, we've had people in the past, for instance, that have contacted us and said, could you take down a story that we had on the website that talks about my diagnosis, because I'm currently applying for new jobs and I worry that, my employer would be seeing this. Is there sort of any, because sometimes when you apply for a new job, when you send the applicants to the HR, they don't even see the name of the person. I don't know, is there any sort of protection for people, for how much the employee can see beforehand, before the interview?
So, I mean, generally, employers have quite a lot of kind of free rein to conduct their interview process or assessment process, recruitment process as they want. So this one protection is this one that I just mentioned, that they can't ask, except for these certain reasons, they can't ask about someone's health. Obviously, that might not prevent, if there is something, they've written a blog post or there's something on the MS Trust website about them, an employer might still see that. There are employers that consciously or unconsciously be affected by that knowledge. So I think at that point, information outside of the kind of recruitment process is a kind of separate issue. But some employers will choose to try and sort of minimize potential even sort of unconscious biases by removing information from an application, or getting it in a way where they can kind of compare applications as objectively as possible. That to some extent is down to the employer, and you get really good employers that take positive action to try and minimize the disadvantages that disabled people are put at. And other employers might not go to take some of those steps. But even if they don't, they shouldn't ask.
Obviously, with lockdown and everything that happened, and we suddenly started working from home, a lot of us, and actually that seemed to benefit quite a lot of people with MS. If you are now supposed to start going back to the office, but you actually feel like you are benefiting from working from home, how can you discuss your needs and any sort of workplace adjustments with employers now when we're sort of moving to either like a hybrid or just back into an office?
Yeah, so I mean, your employer's obligations don't change because you're working from home. So they still have something I didn't mention earlier, but health and safety obligations. They a general duty to, so far as is reasonably practicable, protect the health, safety, and welfare of employees. That applies whether you're in the office or not, or you're in your workplace or not. To some extent, the considerations are the same as if you were working in person.
Yeah.
If your employer's now saying, we've been working from home because of the pandemic, we're now moving back into the office or to part hybrid arrangement or whatever it might be. Well, that would be a what's called a PCP that I mentioned earlier, so a kind of policy or requirement. And if you think that is putting you at a disadvantage, or that because you think it's better for you to be at home, you're finding that much easier, then that would be a potential adjustment. And so you might raise that with your employer and say, I've been working from home for the last however long because of the pandemic, but actually I found I've got better support here. I'm being more, it is enabling me to kind of be more productive in my role, and I'd like to continue working from home. Then that would be a potential adjustment, and probably in those circumstances, obviously it's all going to depend on the particular circumstances, but that's likely, I think, to be reasonable. Because it's if you are managing to kind of do your role and it's supporting you better, then that's kind of a really a win-win for everyone. So I mean, again, it depends on your circumstances in terms of who you discuss that with. If you've got a position where your kind of company or organization you work for generally doesn't know that you have a MS, or doesn't know all the full sort of details and so on, but there's someone you're working with that's saying, commonly an HR who does know that that you work with to do with your any adjustments, then that you approach them and say, this is what I think would be beneficial for me. These are the reasons why, and I think it would be beneficial for the employer as well. And then that's to start that conversation. So that would be a potential adjustment essentially, and one which I'd hope in most circumstances would be reasonable.
Yeah. And I suppose the good thing is, if a lot of us have been working from home for a while, you can sort of show that you have been productive. So there's something to compare with, rather than just sort of spring the suggestion if you haven't been working from home previously. Exactly.
It's much more of a kind of commonly accepted and understood possibility now. I think probably before, there might be maybe more reluctance on an employer's part to say, because it's not sort of tried and tested so much, whereas now they've seen, hopefully, as you say, that someone's been performing their role really well remotely, and they've also then had better support as a result, so that then hopefully they're kind of much more open to that.
So something that I guess you see in your line of work, which is obviously not so nice for people with MS, but if you're having issues at work, say that you, for instance, feel your employer is discriminating against you, or even if you're, feel like you're being bullied at work, being issues that you have, what is the best way to sort of start looking into what you can do about this? Who should you turn to?
So I mean, again, it's going to be depend a little bit on your circumstances and your employer. Let's say, that example you just gave of some of your colleagues, I think you said use the word bullying, which would in this context amount to harassment. So it might be in that context that you that there is someone else in the organization that you have a good relationship with, that you can raise these issues with, and an employer, any reasonable employer, would take that very seriously. Not least because they would themselves be liable for that, what their other employees are doing. So it might be that there's conversations you can have internally that redress the situation, and it might depend what comes out of that, whether they just deal with the individuals involved, or whether there's more there's training that's more widely given, or however it might depend on the individual circumstances. Outside of an employer, two really good sources of advice and information are law centres and citizens advice. So, as I said, I work for South West London Law Centres. We have in our employment team, we provide advice appointments where you can get some, they're means tested. But if you meet those means requirements, then you have an advice session with an advisor who can hear about your situation and give some more tailored advice to your individual circumstances, because obviously all of this depends on, it's very kind of fact dependent. And likewise, many citizens advice and other law centres will provide similar services. And one other organisation that can be really helpful source of support is dispute resolution assistance in the workplace, DRAW, which is a service offered by Yes Law, and they provide free mediation between an employer-employee. So if you are in a position where there is some kind of issue or dispute that needs resolving, then really there's no point at which it would be too early or too late to get DRAW involved, and that kind of mediation with an independent trained mediator can be really really helpful in bringing about a resolution to an issue. So well, I think again we can put the link to that in the show notes as well. One thing just to mention in terms of wanting to resolve things internally, is that ultimately the means by which you can get some compensation generally, or maybe even get an adjustment to be sort of ordered to be put in place, is from an employment tribunal. And you might think, obviously, if you're trying to resolve something internally, generally, if you're in that position where you're still in work, you're not just thinking, I want to get some compensation for this. You're thinking, how can I improve this situation so that I can carry on in this job? And so you might think then that bringing tribunal proceedings is not going to help people come together in a kind of cooperative way. But there is a time limit that applies to make a complaint to an employment tribunal, and it's 3 months less 1 day from the date of the act that to which the complaint relates. And first of all, you need to contact ACAS and notify them of the dispute. That's ACAS, the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service. So you basically have 3 months less 1 day to do that, and then to bring your claim once you've gone through their what's called early conciliation process. And if you have you're trying to resolve something internally, let's say you've raised a grievance that your employer's dealing with, and maybe it's taking some time, that doesn't affect the time limit. So we often have people come to us at the law centre who their complaint relates to something that happened quite a long time ago, because since then they've been trying to resolve it internally, and it's become quite a slow process. And like I said, the fact they've been going through that process doesn't affect the time limit. A tribunal has the discretion to extend the time limit and hear something even though it's happened out of time. So if you are in a position where something's happened at work that you want to bring a claim in relation to, but it happens 5 months ago, you can still bring that claim and persuade the tribunal to extend time, but that is a hurdle that you'll have to get over. You'll have to persuade the tribunal that it's fair to extend time, even though it's brought the claim was brought out of time. So it might be that you have a situation where you're trying to resolve something internally, but to make sure that you sort of protect your ability to bring a tribunal claim, you start that process, and maybe you're able to do that in a way where you can say to the employer, look, I still really want to resolve this internally so that I can continue in my role and and just resolve these issues. But I've started this process just because of those that time limit points. So that's just one thing I wanted to say about the fact that sort of trying to resolve some sort of issue internally doesn't change the time limit that someone has to bring a claim to an employment tribunal.
It's a very tricky thing, isn't it? Because if you really love your job and you love what you're doing and you want to stay there, it's like you say, it's that kind of, I think from what I've seen, people are getting better with raising issues, because it's been very much that kind of, stiff upper lip, let's get on with things. But the more you do that, the easier it will be for problems to occur, won't it? So I guess the best thing is to speak up, but it's not always an easy thing to do.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, it does require people on both sides of any kind of conversation that needs to be had to be, to be reasonable and cooperative and so on. And sometimes employers aren't as much as you might want. So yeah, it can, and it's in some ways a kind of unfortunate state of affairs that there is this short time limit. And that on the one hand, there's obviously an interest in avoiding litigation and wanting things to be resolved internally. But then on the other hand, the way that it works currently is that if you try and do that, you might then lose the ability to bring a tribunal claim. So that's why, I mean, that does put people in a difficult position. But it might be that, they say, I love my job, and stress that to an employer and say, I'm good at this job, I enjoy it, these are the issues I'm having. It's in everyone's interests for us to resolve those. I've been unfortunately, I've had to bring this to notify ACAS because of the time limits that apply in tribunal claims. But stressing that I still want to resolve this issue between us so that I can carry on in this role.
That's a tricky situation.
But it is a tricky position.
We spoke a bit about time off for treatments and medical appointments. I do remember that was one of the things that I first did with kind of reasonable adjustment, because I was taking time off to go to my nurse appointments. But then when I started to go on treatment, I have to have a regular blood test sort of every 3 months. And I suddenly realized that this is racking up a lot of my holiday time. So I did ask, and that was, okay. I work for the MS Trust, so they know about it. So it's not everybody is as fortunate as me on that one. If your employer is sort of saying no, you have to use holiday, is there any kind of, if you're looking at reasonable adjustment, is there anything that you can sort of say, well, actually this or is it just up to the employer?
It's not just up to the employer, but what it is that it will depend on whether it's reasonable or not. And there's no sort of one size fits all approach to that, but in your role, as you said, the MS Trust maybe were especially receptive to those kind of things, as you might imagine. But it was reasonable for them to say, you can have time off for those medical appointments. You don't need to use your annual leave. And whilst maybe the MS Trust were particularly sort of willing to say that, without much difficulty, that kind of outcome may well also be perfectly reasonable for many employers. And so I think it's not like there's a kind of hard and fast rule that it is reasonable to be given time off for medical appointments if you're disabled, if you have MS. But what if your employer is being kind of reluctant to allow that, then I think what you'd be saying is, I think this is reasonable.
Yeah.
For the following reasons, these are the consequences it would have for you, i.e., not many.
Yeah.
This is the benefit it would have for me, quite considerable, and so therefore it's just proportionate to make that adjustment.
Yeah.
And I think also to say that I enjoy this role. I'm good at this role. I want to continue in it. I can't help that these appointments, and that really it's in your interest as well to help me continue as best I can in this role. And again, hopefully, a reasonable employer would be open to that.
Yeah. Talk to me about the Access to Work grant. So this is designed to help you stay in work if you have a physical condition or a disability. Could you tell us a bit about it and how are people eligible for it?
I mean, firstly, you are certainly eligible if you have MS. It's you're eligible if you have some kind of physical condition or disability that's means that you require some support to continue in your role. Essentially, it's a scheme whereby employers can get grants, publicly funded grants, to help pay for an adjustment that someone requires. So, I mean, most employers should be aware of it, and in fact, it might be unreasonable for an employer to say, "Oh, no, this adjustment is too expensive," if they haven't checked to see whether they can get some funding from the Access to Work scheme to help with it. MS would certainly mean you're sort of eligible from a sort of disability point of view. In terms of your employment point of view, employment's really wide. So it includes not just if you're in sort of paid full-time employment on a company payroll, but if you're self-employed as well, then you can access the Access to Work scheme. So it's not just employees, but it might be that if you're self-employed, but you require some specially adapted software for your laptop to be able to whatever it might be, that you can approach Access to Work and that they might be able to fund you to do that. One thing that's sometimes mentioned is that civil servants can't access the Access to Work scheme. However, that's just because they should basically contact their own civil service department for the same sort of funding. Because if you think about it, Access to Work is there to provide public funding to assist people with pay for adjustments to help them stay at work. And so if your employer is already paying you out of public funds, then it kind of doesn't make sense. So whilst civil servants it works slightly differently, it's not different in substance. There's a website actually that people can go on to get some more information on the government website. So that's www.gov.uk/access-to-work/eligibility, and that has kind of full details of the eligibility requirements for the scheme.
Brilliant. We'll pop that link underneath in the show notes as well. There has been a few things that you mentioned that I think we need to pop some links to. We've talked very much about trying to stay in work and your rights and things, but if you feel like you have to either reduce your hours or even take retirement, obviously the big issue here would be how to get enough money to survive on this. So if you have to take retirement or reduce your working hours due to MS, what's your best way to sort of get help financially?
I'm not a sort of benefits expert. We do have benefits experts at the Law Centre that can advise people on their benefits entitlement. I'll deal with reducing hours first. So reducing your hours would be a potential adjustment. So that's a situation where you'd be asking for the requirement that you work full-time to be adjusted so that you can work part-time or on reduced hours. again, it will depend on your circumstances, but there are a range of benefits that then, of welfare benefits that might be available, whether that's PIP, personal independence payment, which isn't means tested, as universal credit, which is, but then has other kind of components to it, such as, well, as I said, I'm not an expert in all the details of all of these different benefits, but then there's some employment and support allowance. And so essentially you might be able to still receive an income from your employer on your reduced hours, and also there might be other welfare benefits you'd be entitled to supplement the reduced income you're getting from your employer. If you've reached a point where you're not going to be able to continue and work at all, then if you've been paying into a private pension scheme, you may qualify to take that pension early for ill health reasons.
Okay.
And that basically means you can get access to your pension earlier than the retirement age. It's something obviously that needs to be considered carefully and in line with sort of medical advice as well, because it can be difficult to kind of, you want to reach a position where you're certain you're not going to be able to continue working. But you then might qualify to take your pension early, and that will depend on the particular pension scheme that you have. And again, it might be the case that you can approach, for example, an organisation like South West London Law Centres or some other law centre or systems advice to get some advice on your eligibility for different welfare benefits, if you are in that position where you're on reduced hours and therefore your income's been reduced.
Right. And we spoke quite a bit about you taking time off for work or treatment and things like that, but there is also something called disability leave, and I did not know about this. Could you talk us through that?
So, I mean, disability leave isn't a kind of defined legal concept like sick leave or maternity leave or something like that. But it's something that some employers now have a policy on. So you said earlier that you yourself get time off for medical appointments. That might be classed by some employers as disability leave. So rather than getting someone to take annual leave for those appointments, that they have a specific policy on providing people with disability leave. And then providing that leave doesn't kind of count against them in any way for attendance monitoring purposes or anything like that. If an employer doesn't have a kind of disability leave policy like that, it might be that it's in effect could be agreed as a reasonable adjustment, and that sounds like the position you yourself are in. That for example, someone with MS needs a period of time away from work for treatment and rehabilitation, and so the employer agrees that they can be paid during that absence and then return to their job afterwards. And that'd be a kind of, even if they don't have a set policy on that, that can be agreed in those circumstances as a reasonable adjustment. So disability leave isn't a kind of standalone concept that applies across the board like sick leave, maternity leave or something like that. It depends a bit on each employer, but it might be that your employer does have a disability leave policy, or even if they don't, that you can agree the sort of benefits of that as a reasonable adjustment in your circumstances.
That's very interesting. I mean, it feels like a lot of this is kind of a common thread of that there is a lot of things put into place to protect people with MS or people with disabilities, but there's no set in stone way of how to get to these things. So I think it seems to me from what you're saying that the best thing is to go and talk to HR or talk to people like yourself to sort of actually get the ball rolling if you have any kind of issue on these things.
I mean, the way the legislation is framed is so that it can be flexible and apply in a whole range of circumstances, because if it tried to be too prescriptive, it would mean some people then might miss out because they don't fit within the sort of more carefully defined requirements. So that's why you have this very flexible duty to make reasonable adjustments. It's so that anything might potentially be an adjustment, but as you say, it also then means that it's not that it's not black and white. This is reasonable and this isn't. That it all depends. But something like disability leave is, as I say, something that a lot of employers now will have a specific policy on, because they recognise that it is probably going to be reasonable in most circumstances to allow a disabled person time off medical appointments. And so rather than having that to be something that's agreed and discussed each time, that they just have a set policy on that, to kind of essentially say we will always make that as a reasonable adjustment in those circumstances almost. But yes, it is the downside of the kind of flexibility is that there is some uncertainty quite often.
So I guess it puts quite a lot of responsibility at the person to actually dare to speak up and dare to push your issues yourself.
It does, but I think so I said earlier that an employer has those obligations, like the teacher, to make reasonable adjustments only if they know or could reasonably be expected to know that someone has a disability. So that means that an employer can't just sort of sit on its rest on its heels and just sort of put its fingers in its ears and say and sort of not look out for its employees. And so if there's an employee who suddenly is taking more time off, or is frequently saying they've got a doctor's appointment or something like that, or maybe is noticeably fatigued or whatever it might be, a reasonable employer or an employer is expected to, in a confidential, appropriate, considerate manner, approach that person and see if they're how they're doing, and as I said, in a kind of appropriate, confidential manner. That might just mean referring them to occupational health rather to discuss with a professional. So in those circumstances, an employer is expected to do something to sort of check if an employee is okay, or if an employee requires some adjustments. But ultimately, if you do need an adjustment agreed, that's going to require some kind of two-way process, and obviously that can be really difficult or scary for someone to disclose a condition, but hopefully there's a way that they can have that conversation, even if it's just with one person in HR or a manager that they're particularly sort of trusting relationship with, or whatever it might be, to start that conversation. And obviously, like I said, that's unfortunately going to depend on someone's individual circumstances. But those are the kind of the obligations and requirements that are in place and are placed on an employer as well to take some action.
It's been very, very interesting listening to all this. Thank you so much for chatting with us. If you have one sort of piece of advice or anything that you've come across in your line of work that you would give to people with MS, is there anything you would like to have as a parting word?
It's difficult because obviously it is also fact dependent. I think people. I would stress the importance of trying to get some advice on your situation if you feel like you need it, and that organisations like law centres and citizens advice and other organisations in the advice sector are there to provide that advice, because it's really important for people to receive it. So I think it can be difficult for people because you go online and you research and there's almost too much information out there, and you're kind of overloaded by it and you don't know what to read and what to listen to. But if you can contact like I said, law centre, citizens advice to ask them a question and then get that advice on your circumstances, and that's going to be really helpful and kind of cut through the noise of 1,000 different articles online. So I suppose that's one sort of more universally applicable parting word.
Thank you so much, Law. That's been so interesting and very useful.
No, thanks very much for having me on the podcast. It's been really enjoyable.
Now, if this was a commercial podcast, here's where there would be an advert. But as we're a charity, we don't do that. So instead, we'd like to take the opportunity to tell you all about our fantastic resources for people with MS.
Our website, which is mstrust.org.uk, has tons of information and resources for people affected by MS in the UK. We've also got some really useful resources for working life and MS. So if you just head over to our A to Z of MS and look under W for work, you'll find it there.
Now over to Gideon about working life with MS, both as a person with MS, but also an HR professional.
Good morning. My name is Gideon Schulman. I was diagnosed with MS in 2001. My background is in human resources. It's after university, I've always had a career in that area, and also when I've sort of done any voluntary roles, I've always been called on to with my MS experience and background. I suppose that's part of the reason you asked me to chat to you today. But I've also used that I've been involved with other organisations, including Shift MS and the MS Society, and I'm currently working with as vice chair of Canine Partners, where I seem to take the HR portfolio there as well. So it's that's a quick background. And I suppose I'm a bit of a northerner. I grew up in Leeds, and I now live in sunny London with my wife and beautiful 12-week-old daughter, which keeps me slightly busy and definitely on my toes in relation to my MS as well. So it's definitely entertaining.
Yeah, the best sort of challenge.
Definitely.
So do you want to just sort of start at the beginning and tell us a little bit about your MS diagnosis and some of the initial symptoms?
Yeah, so I think, to be honest, my MS probably started when I was, in sort of sixth form, I was around the age of 17. I was doing my A levels, and I was already starting to get symptoms back then. I don't think I was different to many people. It's sort of the usual sort of pins and needles, balance issues, fatigue. And it sort of continued into my, continued into my university days. And I think it was very much, when I went to see the doctors at the time, the GPs, and I was very much told that, it's typical, student stress, all the work going on, and, don't worry about it, it'll go away. And I suppose with it being, in effect, relapsing, remitting MS, it did go away. It also came back again. But it wasn't until, September, I think 2001, when I was formally diagnosed, and that was on the back of actually getting optic neuritis, and that was sort of the telling sign, sort of before then I could be sent away for my MRIs and everything to confirm that. I still remember the day of sort of going into the consulting room with Dr. Helen Ford, but this back in Leeds, and her saying, she said, you've got MS, and I had a very rational response. I just said to her, well, I don't know what it is. You'll have to explain it to me, please. I was sat with, my mother was sat next to me, and unfortunately she'd known people with MS, and they had it quite severe. And so my mother obviously just put that image with me, and thought the worst case scenario. And thankfully I'm not in that position, but I think even at that stage, it was about making sure I was informed and had all the information at hand, and so I knew how to manage it as best as I could.
And what are some of the most common symptoms you experience with your MS now? Obviously, you mentioned optic neuritis at the beginning, but is that something that's carried through? Are there any others that you experience these days?
I think it's, to a great extent, I don't want to sort of be teaching anyone to suck eggs, and MS is so it is different in everybody. And from my perspective, I did have sort of relapsing and remitting for the first 10 years. And then after that, it did become secondary progressive. So, whereas I went through various phases with problems with my eyes and sort of pins and needles and things. Now I'm at a stage where it's predominantly fatigue and walking. It's and it's shifted over the years. And I suppose the classic with MS is when you wake up in the morning, you just don't necessarily know what you're going to wake up with. So it's not a pleasant surprise. It's always a surprise to know exactly what you have. But I think predominantly I am getting my head around having to pace myself and manage myself with fatigue, because as you probably know, I always describe fatigue like a small child with a light switching it on and off whenever they want. And you can have 8 hours really good sleep and be shattered physically and mentally when you wake up, or you can just have a really busy day and be fine.
So obviously this podcast is about things like work and MS. How does fatigue and some of your other symptoms affect you when you're at work?
As I was sort of saying before, as my MS has changed over the years, so has the need for support from my employers. When I was first working, I had very different symptoms to what I do now. And so the adjustments were, to a great extent, were different to what I needed now. So, I remember needing at the time, it was about having better seating, being close to the toilets, and my employers were very good about that. And I was able to work full time. Whereas I think now it's I had to stop working sort of full time, and in a few years ago, I decided that I would work for myself and set my own business. Okay, I'm working more hours than I did before, but I can manage those hours and time because it's very much I'm very 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 influenced by fatigue, or very impacted by fatigue. But when I have been working, I think it was very much about having that strong relationship with my employers and know what's available, not necessarily what was entitled to, but what I could get to make my life easier and to make sure I could continue to give a full job. So it was work, making use of the OTs at the hospital for ideas, and I remember them coming up with different grips for pens and suggestions of digital software to record my voice. I also made use of Access to Work, which is fantastic service in itself. But I think the difficulty is, over the years, you change employers, and you can be very comfortable with that employer, but you change job or role, and I suppose that your MS is constantly shifting, which means your needs are constantly shifting. So I think it makes it particularly difficult, working out exactly what you need and when and how and what.
And then in terms of some of those adjustments that your employers have made in the past, what were some examples of like really good adjustments that you've had?
Yeah, so some of the adjustments were quite straightforward, or quite easy ones, really. It's it was having, at the time, it was replacing my chair when I had difficulty getting up and out of a chair, because at work I only ever sat down for brief periods of time, so it was having a chair that was more suitable. It was changing a desk that was at one point I was measured for a chair, and I thought I was actually sat on the Starship Enterprise. It was such a fancy chair, it was ridiculous, and with all these buttons and things, I just didn't know what to do with half of them. And I think that's an extreme example, but I've also been in with employees where they've just given me a better quality chair than what is standard. I think also, when they've been able to relocate my sort of desk so I am closer to the bathroom. So whenever I'm needed, that's made life easier. And equally, wherever one of my employers had a car park, and they reassigned the parking bay actually with a senior director at the time, so I could be closer. I wasn't using the disabled parking bays. I didn't need it at that time, but I swapped with one of the senior directors, so I could be closer to the door. To a great extent, some of the changes haven't needed to be major, but actually been very beneficial to me. As my MS progressed, I negotiated that if I work better in the mornings, I schedule all my meetings to be in the morning, and so I can do a different sort of work in the afternoon, and equally, flexible working. If I'm needed to work from home and not be in the office, I manage that. I think it's very beneficial to be going into the office or having that hybrid sort of working, because then I get to interact with people, and they get to appreciate how my health impacts me, and I think also that social interaction, I think it works much better, but both having that blend of working from home and going in. But I think the key thing for me, from my perspective, was not to, it's probably psychological. I didn't want to feel I was a burden to my employers. I didn't want them to have an excuse that I wasn't working. So, I probably worked harder than other people because, to overcompensate, because I knew I had that difficulty. And so I probably did myself a disservice. And I think a lot of people with disabilities do, because they want to prove that they're not impacted, their work isn't impacted by the disability. And so you do extra work rather than asking for help sometimes.
That's a really important point, actually. Sometimes it can sort of knock your confidence in the workplace, or people will feel like maybe they don't go after the career progression that they might have if they weren't affected by MS. Have you got any tips, sort of looking back now on your career, that you would give to other people about how not to let MS affect their confidence in the workplace?
I learned very early on that I need to own my health. I can't just expect others to take the lead. I need to know what's available, and so I can. At the end of the day, your employees have got enough things to deal with. They've got other employees, have got enough work on. You don't need to add to that if you like. So it's being able to go to them with the answers already. There's nothing worse than employees going to their employers with problems without solutions. So I mentioned access to work. Having that in place, or knowing how that works, is hugely beneficial. And it's also good to get to know other people in the organisation. I think one of the things is, I mentioned the example of the car parking, but I'd made good relationships with the facilities team. So that I could work with them, or that we could work as a team. So it wasn't just, here's Gideon again with another problem. It's actually having everything in place, and because the less problems you present, the easier it is for everybody around you.
Those tips are really great. Obviously, a lot of it does revolve around communications and open discussions with your employer. I know when we did the Work and MS webinar for MS Awareness Week, there were a lot of questions around disclosure and things like when you should tell your employer about your MS, whether it's right to do that at interview stage or later on. Do you have any sort of advice for people in terms of discussing that with their employer?
I think it's a really good question, and there's no one right answer at all. And ultimately, when it comes to sort of interview stage, if an employer wants you or doesn't want you, that they will consciously or subconsciously work out a way to take you on or not take you on. So, whether you have a disability or not, they will find a way. Okay, I'm giving away trade secrets of, in HR doing recruitment, but if even when you're scoring people subconsciously, you will find the answers you want to give the right scores. You can't have a blanket answer to that of whether you should disclose at interview. It's about whether you feel comfortable and doing that. I think to be honest, it took a while for me to be confident about my MS within myself. And I think you've got to be confident within yourself before you just start disclosing it to other people. And you will go to some employers and they will embrace the fact that, that you've got a disability and make the most of it. And others that will go, I just don't need that trouble. I don't need that burden. It's going to be a real pain. I just can't take them on. So I don't think anybody can tell you whether you should disclose it or not at interview. If you're asked, you're certainly not allowed to lie. You won't be asked directly whether you have disability or not, but if it's asked in such a way where you end up lying, then you could get into problems from an employment law perspective. And from my perspective, if you do disclose at interview and you don't get the job, you don't want to work for them, really. It's not the sort of environment or employee you want to work with. So rather than seeing that you as a failure, or you've been turned down for the job, or you're not good enough, you just don't want to work for those sort of people. And you don't need it, because if that's how they're behaving at interview stage, how they're going to behave later on.
And what about when you start in a role and maybe you've been there for a little while and you feel like you are deserving of some sort of promotion or career progression, but you feel perhaps maybe you've been passed up because of your MS? Is there anything you can or you should do at that point?
Within that, you're moving into the realms of potential discrimination, or it's MS is recognised as a protected characteristic, and I think if you genuinely believe you're being discriminated against, I think then it's a matter of trying to gather those facts and then go to HR. I think the difficulty with anything like that is you might believe it's going on, but that having evidence to prove that it cannot be very difficult. And I suppose that one avenue really is to push back on them in that position and say, well, okay, why am I not getting those roles? What can I have feedback? It's making use of use those managers to your advantage and say, well, what do I need to be able to progress? You show me what I need. So it gets to the point whereby if they've done that for you, they will have a very weak argument for not promoting you or supporting you. So put that that professional development in place, and getting pushing the emphasis back on them so they have less reason why you should be being promoted. Because I'll say it can be very difficult to prove that you're that is why you're not getting promoted. And if it gets down to hearsay, you can't really have run a grievance process without just on hearsay. You need some level of proof. So I think if you can push back on those individuals and say, help me to, mentor me, coach me, so I can have that promotion, or do that personal development, then they'll have a less excuse, which puts you in a stronger position than you were before.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it will hopefully help you in the longer run to sort of build your career progression plan and sort of know which areas you could improve, because like you say, it could just be a misunderstanding, then it may not be MS related, some of the reasons that you're not getting that development. So when, just going back a little bit, when you first told your employers about MS, how did you discuss that with them? Was it something that they sort of knew about as a condition, or did you have to educate them a little bit?
So when I first spoke to my managers to discuss it with them, they didn't have a clue as to what MS was. that I think he'd heard about it because I think it was Richard Pryor, the comedian that had MS, and so he'd heard of it. It wasn't completely foreign to him, but had no clue at all what it was. And so, from my perspective, it was about telling him what it was in a very in a very high level way. And I think, I mentioned before that I'd spoken to the other manager who said don't bombard them with information because either too much of them take on, or to be honest, they don't necessarily care about the ins and outs of what's wrong with you. And that's true. Your employers don't need to understand MS and have a detailed knowledge of your internal system. They ultimately just need to know how it impacts you and what they need to do. Even as an employer myself, when people come to me with personal difficulties or health difficulties, I need to weigh up how much information do I need to know, because ultimately all I want to do is be able to support you and to do your job. And if I can help you, that's great. But I don't need to know that, the ins and outs on a medical level. So when I spoke to them, I kept my manager in the first place, I kept it very high level. I think I explained it that my internal wiring was basically shot, and it affects me in various ways, and it doesn't actually stop. And the key was to reassure him that my performance wasn't going to go down, and I wasn't going to be a burden to him. That actually I'll still be a very valued member of the team, and it's that reassurance I think also encourage helps them.
And before we started this call, we sort of discussed how you're an employer yourself now, and you have quite a lot of people as part of your team. Has sort of your own experiences of MS and disclosing that changed how you have those conversations with people you employ, maybe made you more empathetic of different situations, or sort of approach it a little bit differently?
Yeah, I think so. And I suppose I've also used that in my HR role over years when I've sort of coached managers, in the respect that it's about if I've spotted there's anything wrong with or any of my employees are having difficulty or challenges, don't just put it down to poor performance. It's a matter of sitting down and talking to them and being proactive with your employees and saying, is there anything wrong? Is there anything wrong? How can I support you? How can I help you? And I'd like to say I practice what I preach. I hope I do. And I think people, when you have your one-to-ones or supervisions or whatever you want to call them, I think people need to remember they don't have to be formal and just talk about work. And you should always, start those meetings off with asking about that individual and how they're doing, and building up that rapport and building up that relationship, so people feel at ease to be able to disclose if they've got something going on. And over the years, I've had people who have got to a point where they're comfortable to disclose they're having difficulties at home, difficulties with their health, difficult with finances, all sorts of personal problems that impact their lives, that they need support and help with. And then it's a matter of saying, okay, how can we work together to minimize that impact and help them going forward. And again, you hit it on the head at the beginning about saying it's all about good communication.
So if you're someone with MS and you're sort of struggling maybe with your workload, or you're finding work a little bit much, when do you think it's time to sort of maybe think about winding down the number of hours you work, or making some big adjustments to your role?
It's a really good question, and another one that I'm going to be slightly vague on in respect. It depends what work you're doing. If you're a contractor working on the underground, working as an engineer, or you're going to have health and safety issues if you're not, if you're not well enough to do those things. Whereas if you've got an office-based job, you're going to have more time flexibility. For me, I had a job where I was doing a lot of traveling, and so it's about almost doing that if you like, that impact assessment yourself to work out how much effect is it really having on my work. And and you can talk to often there's a health and safety person in your organization. You can chat through them how you calculate sort of impact on your job. I forgot to mention earlier that when you do talk to your employer, make sure you speak to whoever your health and safety officer is, because I remember they had to put a system in place, because when we had a fire, unfortunately, in the building, they had to make sure I had somewhere special to go, because I couldn't get down all the stairs. So I know I'm throwing that in there now. I've just remembered, but it's making sure that you're not causing a risk to anybody at all. And so I had to sit on the stairwell whilst everybody escaped from the building. So it was a bit nerve-wracking, but it was fine. It's about understanding. Only you will know how that how your MS is impacting you, and you have to be honest. Just be honest with yourself, because there's no point in making yourself ill because of it. I know that my MS is worse when I'm stressed out, and so I'm consciously aware that not to do things that are going to particularly stress me out, because that's going to make me worse, and that I'm not only health-wise, but my performance-wise, I'm not going to be able to deliver the work I need to do. It's all that. It's very much about self-awareness and the impact on you. And when you start to think, now I've got to make more significant changes to my work, then that's when you start to have a conversation. And initially it might be a matter of working from home, or reducing your hours, or having sort of flexible working around your hours. Can be, as long as you get the work done. So it doesn't matter if you're working at 12 o'clock at night, not working at 9 o'clock in the morning, because that works ultimately for both of you. And then when you're then ultimately you get to the point where if you have to reduce your hours, or you can't work at all, then that's the next conversation. Are you going to discuss having changing your contract to part-time? Are you going to apply for ill health retirement? Again, you need to make sure you're aware. You need to be on top of and aware of what benefits and how systems work. Some people apply for ill health retirement, don't realize how complex it is. And the other side of ill health retirement, for example, is you've got to know the full impact of it. Do all your research before you go, before you make those changes.
Are there any sort of resources that people can go to get that information, like any websites or anything that are really helpful?
Well, I suppose I should start off by promoting the MS Trust. You guys have some fantastic resources. I have to say, in all the years I've had MS, I've always been very impressed by the resources the MS Trust has. I've always found them very practical. I'm not just saying that because I'm on here now, but I have generally found them very practical. I think a lot of the major MS charities, and I won't list them all have very good resources to turn to. So I think they're a good starting point. If there's an OT, an occupational therapist, attached to your neurologist, it's worth being referred to them. It's worth having a conversation with them. They can be very practical. And then there's other resources such as access to work, which again is very useful. But I think, interestingly enough, you need to think slightly wider. I read magazines that aren't about MS but about disabilities, and you see there's recommendations for things that can help people who have got visual impairment or hearing impairment, and you can think, that'd be really useful if I use that. So key is not to have sort of tunnel vision and think, oh, I should only look at MS resources, but actually there are other, there are other charities that focus on specific disabilities, or even very generic ones. I'm desperately trying not to mention other magazines and things, but there are some really good ones out there. I, as an employer and a person with MS, I've found some really helpful guidance from them.
So just to finish off then, before we started the call, we were sort of talking about MS and its prominence in the media and how important it is to discuss the condition and sort of raise awareness. We know that Selma Blair's been doing quite a lot of work on it recently and has just released a biography. I think it was in The Guardian last week or the week before, where they pulled an excerpt from it where Selma talked about how she was advised by doctors not to disclose MS because it would affect her chances of getting different roles as an actor. What would be your advice for someone who's maybe looking for work but has previously disclosed their MS, whether it's sort of on platforms like social media or it's quite widely known? Do you think it's something that could, I know we talked about it earlier about, if someone really wants you, then that shouldn't get in the way. But what about if you've sort of already made that decision to disclose it and you're a little bit nervous about that?
I think it's interesting. I don't quite know how Hollywood works, and I can't claim to be a movie star or a famous producer, but I think in Hollywood, and we were talking about this earlier, it shows how it can work either way. You look at somebody like Michael J. Fox, and who has made his Parkinson's work for him. He's taken on some very good roles, and he's carried, and his Parkinson's hasn't been a secret, and it's worked really well. And I'm not plugging his, but biographies in particular, but he has written. I've read. He seems to have multiple ones, but I've read them, and they're very good. Again, as I was saying slightly before, you don't have to sort of zone in on MS only, and I think to that extent, Parkinson's is very good, and I don't think, I can't speak for Selma, but we have been, celebrities over the years who have disclosed their MS, and it hasn't, held them back. I think people have to be very aware of if you do things publicly, or not even necessarily publicly, that goes on social media, it's there permanently. You can't get away from it. I know that I've been for interviews, and employers regularly do sort of background checks on people, and I'm all over the internet over fundraising and things to do with MS. Even to the point when I was dating, people could look me up, and they saw that I had MS. It was too late for me to hide it. I couldn't hide it, and I think it's a matter of, said before, it's a matter of owning it, and also putting it across in a way that it doesn't appear that it's going to be a detriment. It's not going to be baggage that people are going to have to deal with. It's something that you need to make it play to your strengths. You need to say, look, actually, ultimately I have this illness, but actually it makes me a stronger and better person. I'm more self-aware for it. I can do things better than other people because I know how to do things. I think you sort of need to turn it around on its head, if you like, because especially if it's on social media, and it's so accessible to people. You need to, there's no point in denying it. It's about upselling it and selling yourself. I'm not a marketeer, but I think you can make it work for yourself. And I do. There's nothing worse than when people on TV haven't got MS and they try and act it out. But people with disabilities have made it work for you. It's and you can. I used to watch Silent Witness, and I think it was Liz Carr was on there, and she made her disability work for her, which is fantastic. And I think you shouldn't be scared if you do have it, of not upselling it, and showing what a benefit it can be to employers.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us today and sort of sharing so openly your experiences with MS.
No, I hope it helps, and I think it's MS is very much a journey, and as I said earlier on, whatever you start out at doesn't mean that you've got it 6 months, a year on, and whatever, and you've got, it's about that self-awareness and that communication. So I think it can be depressing for some people, and it can be very difficult. But if you are struggling, ask for help. Don't be shy in asking for help. And there's plenty of help out there. As I say, whether it's MS organisations or wider, there's plenty of support and help out there. Don't do it alone.
And we're back.
Oh, that was a lot to get through today. Lots and lots of information. I think I'm not an HR expert, and I'm not an expert when it comes to anything to do with law. So it's been a lot of learning today. But I think it's really interesting to sort of hear that a lot of it's not like a set out road that this is how it will work for everyone. It will be different from person to person. And I think both Gideon and Lance said that. So I guess it's a case of actually, if you have an issue, whatever that could be, I mean, if it's something to do with, getting something changed at work, or if it's to do with disclosure, you really have to think about what you want to get out of the situation and then sort of talk to someone. And I guess both of them were sort of advised to talk to both HR, but maybe like a colleague or a manager or someone you trust at work to sort of get started. And then what will happen, I guess, who knows? But I think, I guess for myself as a person with MS, I was always a little bit worried about raising issues because you don't want to be a bother. And sometimes you kind of feel like, okay, well, if it's a really big issue, obviously I would talk about it. But if it's like it took me forever, for instance, to sort of ask if I could be moved away from where I sat. When I first started working at the MS Trust, I sat really close to where the office manager sat, and the telephones were ringing all the time, and it really caused my concentration to go completely haywire. And it took me forever to just kind of get the confidence to ask my manager to say, could I sit somewhere differently, because it's just distracting to me. So I think sometimes we just have to try to be brave ourselves as well, because you just don't want to be a bother.
Yeah, it's sort of that. Sometimes it can be one of those conversations that you feel a little bit awkward having, but sort of like Gideon said, really, sometimes it's about not only having that conversation, but having an end goal in mind, or maybe some sort of suggestions that you can make, and make those conversations a little bit easier. And yeah, it can just be something as simple as, like you say, moving away to a different desk or having a slightly different desk setup. It doesn't have to break the bank for your employer. So there should be, in theory, no reason for them to object if you're happy to sort of work it through with them and come up with these sensible suggestions.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to hear about things like the access to work scheme as well. So if you are an employer who has an employee with MS, then that's maybe something to look into if there is something more expensive that needs, adjusting. I find it interesting. I had, when I was first diagnosed, I worked not at the MS Trust, I worked somewhere differently, and I went to tell HR, and they sprung upon me directly, sort of asking me questions like, can we do anything? Is there anything we can help with? And I had no idea, because I'd just literally been diagnosed that day. And I think that can also be maybe one of those things that if you go and talk to someone, and if you have to have an end goal in mind is a good idea, but when you just get asked that question, I was just like, I don't know, because I didn't know about appointments. I didn't know if there was anything I could do. So I think I just asked, could I maybe work from home a little bit? And they were like, okay, sure, fine. And then I thought, maybe I should have written down some questions and things beforehand. So I think maybe go prepared and keep notes. And I think that is, especially if things would go wrong, it's really good to have documentation afterwards to sort of pinpoint that well, this is what we agreed on, and this is what you said, and this is what I said. I mean, you obviously don't go into these things hoping that anything would go wrong, but if they do, then it's good to...
Just always best to have yourself covered, isn't it, in the first instance?
Yeah. We should also mention, which I think we did maybe talk about a little bit, that there was a webinar on this topic of work in MS, which actually had both Gideon and Lance, plus a special clinical specialist occupational therapist called Joanne Herf as well. That's all. You can watch the whole thing on our YouTube channel, but we'll pop a link in the show notes as well, because that will cover some more of the issues that was talked about today.
So if you've got any questions about MS and the world of work, whether that's from listening to this podcast, watching the webinars, or sort of your work life itself, you're more than welcome to give our MS helpline a call. They're available from Monday to Friday, except UK bank holidays. That's from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And outside of these hours, you can leave us a message and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So the number for our MS helpline and inquiry service is 0800 032 3839, or you can email us at ask@mstrust.org.uk, and that service is available to anyone who wants to know more about multiple sclerosis, not just those living with the condition themselves.
And you can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Google and Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music. And get in touch and like and subscribe. We always love it when people spread the word about us. And I was also going to say, get in touch and tell us what you thought about this episode and this podcast itself. Maybe you have a story to tell about working life with MS. Maybe you have a really good story where things went wrong, or maybe you have a story where things didn't go wrong. Do get in touch with us and let us know what's going on. Let us know what topics you'd like to hear in the future on the podcast. And if you're new to MS, or if you're new to this podcast, be sure to check out the other episodes of Multiple Sclerosis Breaking It Down. And finally, we would like to say a big thank you to Anne Chapman Audio for the music of this podcast.